always cost too much because publishers keep producing new editions, bringing down the resale value. They take too much time to read, and they're about as interesting as watching a race between grass growing and paint drying. Then we realized our students are right. Books are expensive for what you get, even though what you get can be an enormous book with all the facts you could ever need on the subject at hand. In fact, as we conversed further, we realized that was the problem. There is an inverse correlation between the size of the book and the experience the students have controlling such a vast body of data. Often the students miss the forest for the trees. Graphic designers know that books can help students along. Modern texts are illustrated with artwork, charts, maps, photographs, and tables, and that's just the print version before we get to the accompanying website. Then there's the design of the text, with the bold-faced vocabulary, the headers for various levels of detail, chapter opening pages with outlines, chapter ending pages with study questions, and appendices with glossaries. Gerard and I decided to see how far we could push the concept that the design can teach the student something about the subject they're studying. Can we have a book that has the form of the subject it's trying to convey? Can form follow function? I teach history surveys, and I've developed some tricks that served me well. One of them came from having to teach the entire U.S. history survey. I had to have a final exam question that required students to go back to the beginning, and so that meant I had to have a topic that I revisited every so often throughout the course. The textbook I was using at the time, John Blum's National Experience, had something on how each war the U.S. fought affected its economy, so I decided to go with that. To help the students, I would introduce that portion of the lecture with an aphorism, a catchphrase, a mantra, a slogan. War always costs more than cash on hand. We went through the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. This was a while ago. And every time I would remind them that war always costs more than cash on hand, and then launch into how the government paid for the war. And every time something would go wrong, and the government would have to try something else next time, until you get to the Vietnam War, where there's no declaration of war, and therefore no moment at which Congress has to figure out how to pay for it. When I was explaining to this, one of my students, a Vietnam War veteran, suddenly said, yes, war always costs more than cash on hand. It's like a little light bulb going on over his head. So Gerard saw the possibility for visualizing this as a credit card with General Custer playing the role of the American Express centurion, the key years across the front and the key data on the back. As part of the impossibility of this ever becoming a textbook publishers adopt and bookstores sell, we're offering individual prints from this limited series for the price of $1 each. And you can sign your own print. Another way to develop a final exam question is to find an event with deep roots and a long reach. And the Civil War performed that function for me. The more I teach it, the more I realize the Civil War starts in the 17th century and continues through the 20th. The historians trace the roots of the Civil War back to the constitutional compromises with slavery. Of course, the introduction of slavery itself. And the issues of race and regional rivalry that the Civil War highlighted have cast a long shadow into the present. Hence we visualized the Civil War as the eye of a giant needle through which these ribbons pass. I want to thank Carmina Ocampo Brown for sewing all the ribbons, which are printed cotton. Each ribbon lays out a timeline for the war, the developments in the economy that pitted industry against agriculture and slavery against free labor, the developments in technology that taught a young George Clemenceau lessons he would use in World War I. The party rivalries and the constitutional quarrels that developed into bloodshed. You can follow one ribbon, or you can interweave them. You can think of other timelines that could come with their own ribbons and their own colors, with their own designs. The one that's long been the most visual for me is the Cold War. I developed my lectures on the Cold War by reading Ralph Levering's short book on the subject. Levering had 4 chapters And after doing this for a long time, I began associating them with 4 images. Although Americans usually use the word containment to describe the early Cold War, it seemed to me that with the Soviets and the Americans trying to pile up rivals on their side, and with them competing for primacy in outer space and in the nuclear field, it's more like a seesaw. When the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, it's an occasion when the Soviets and the Americans discover something that they actually have in common. They're not on 2 ends of the seesaw. They're together in their realization that they should be the only 2 powers with nuclear weapons, on top of a pedestal with all of the other countries, at the bottom. Well, in 1964, the People's Republic of China jumps to the top of the pedestal. It acquires an atomic weapon, and so our model has to change. The USSR, the US, and the PRC agree not so much to pile up allies against each other as to respect each other's sphere of influence. And so the model changes to a mobile with the sides in balance. Ronald Reagan goes back to a bipolar Cold War, a wall between the sides. When you draw the wall for the students, you always have to make it short so the Americans can shoot over it, because that's what the Soviets were afraid of, that we'd hide behind our Strategic Defense Initiative and we'd get them. Anyway, I want to thank Temple University student Vakatis for making the little models, computer generating the models of the various phases of the Cold War. They fit together, the little triangle in pieces, and this one's already put in there, so you can see the little pieces going together. And it's like a little Rubik's Cube. You assemble each model together, it fits together all together, and the student can kind of teach themselves, sorry about that, students can kind of teach themselves how to make it work as they go together. I'm sorry, it's supposed to be held together with magnets, but the magnets are being a little uncooperative. Anyway, so there you go. We'd like to argue that our impossible books are actually very possible from a student point of view. They're short, it's easy to identify the important parts of the narrative, they're interactive enough, and none of them are too expensive. By the same token, this may make them impossible books in the modern textbook marketplace. Thank you. Next speaker.